They're still looking for great customer outcomes. They want processes to be efficient, effective, reducing their costs. They want to be compliant with their regulations. They want their staff to enjoy their work and not feel frustrated that things don't work. They're all the outcomes you get from a good BPM.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I get the absolute privilege to sit down with different BPM practitioners, people that are day in and day out putting BPM into practice. And I absolutely love these conversations because I learn a lot, I glean a lot. And so if you're listening to this episode right now, get out your pens and your notepads, get ready to take notes because I know this is going to be a very interesting conversation. Today I have Nigel Adams joining me. Now, Nigel is the director at Hetton Advisory, has also got 15 plus years of BPM experience working with banks and has worked in two of Australia's largest banks. So this is going to be a very exciting conversation. Nigel, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about a subject that I'm passionate about and love.
That's great. So that was obviously a very condensed, brief introduction. What our audience love to, appreciate getting to know is, when did you first get into BPM? How was BPM introduced to you? And then take us on a journey leading up to what you're doing today.
Well, there's a beautiful little saying from the UK where I originally come from, which is a good indication of my overall career experience and history. And my resume looks like a dog's breakfast. I've worked in so many different industries, so many different sort of functions. But the common thread has always been sort of process. And I guess from a formal perspective, the first real introduction was when I did an MBA way back in 1990. And this is at Warwick Business School in the UK. And I did an elective in a subject called Service Operations Management. And obviously, as part of an operations management sort of course, there was a pretty heavy focus on process. Now, it wasn't called BPM at the time, but obviously lots of the precursors to what became BPM were introduced in that program. Right. But what I realized was that I grew up in a small business, and my parents used to run sort of fish and chip shops. So the conversation all around me was always around process. But not necessarily in those terms. I can remember conversations with my mum used to want to see the queue of customers going halfway down the street for the shop, where my dad wanted them sort of to be just enough people in the queue to make sure that the customer was getting served quickly, but that they weren't so that we could actually sort of get the throughput rate for preparing the sort of the food, having a limited menu, because it was much easier to sort of to keep the food fresh than was having an extensive menu, and how you actually sort of got the fish there and how you got the potatoes and the prepare. So there's all this sort of stuff going on, which was around process management. But obviously we never sort of modeled it in any way. We never sort of talked about it in those terms. And then pretty much through every other job I had since leaving uni, whether it was in consulting, whether it was sort of when I was working at the banks, there's been this underpinning of operations and process management.
Right. That's great. And would you say that it's a certain type of person that I guess naturally sees the world or sees the things that are happening in the world as a process? Or would you say that it's something that obviously it's something that can be learned and can be taught? But I guess in these conversations I have, I often find that people that find themselves in the BPM world or sphere naturally see the world as a process, or see the things they can identify processes without even really thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a bit of a curse actually, because you can be very irritating to family and friends when you sort of, you're constantly pointing things out. I mean, I remember one of my colleagues back in the UK when I used to run pubs. He was the catering manager for the pubs I used to run. And he and his wife and my wife and I, we'd sort of go out for dinner as well. He was the most frustrating person to go out to dinner with, because he'd point out all these process deficiencies around how the restaurant was operating. So yeah, it is a bit of and you do see it like that. But I think that's the same for pretty much any industry. Anybody who's worked with salespeople, they just see the opportunity. They just see the they've got that optimistic positivism about, where the next dollar deal is going to come from. And it's the same with process managers and operations managers. They just look at how things work. In fact, it's one of the things I encourage when I sort of trained people and taught lots of sort of staff about how, about operations and process management. I would say, just think about your everyday life. How do you get to work in the morning? How do you get out of bed? Why does it take 20 minutes to get to work one day and 15 minutes the next day? When you go, why does one restaurant sort of have a configuration that allows you to see the chef and the staff in the kitchen versus those that they're hidden away from view? What about sales? Why are they different conversations? So it's asking that question about why things work the way they do. I think that is something that is pretty much fundamental to anybody with that natural sort of process bent.
And we were obviously having a conversation before we got started here, and one thing you were talking about is how BPM is adopted differently, or I guess has had different levels of success depending on the vertical or the industry, the sector. Can you talk to us about that, and I guess which industries you've seen it work really well for, and then which industries you see as it being more of a challenge?
Yeah, well, I think from a sector perspective, there's probably a more straightforward split. And you look at the difference between manufacturing and services, or services and government as well, and the public sector. But clearly ERP systems, the quality movement was really sort of formed off the back of manufacturing, and those huge gains that manufacturing made. Well, I guess it started with the Japanese in the 60s, but sort of then it entered into sort of more global manufacturing by the late 70s and 80s. And by the time the 90s came along and ERP systems were sort of commonplace, there was this focus on process. And obviously you had things like Michael Hamer, I'm not quite sure how he's pronounced his name, Hamer and Champney with his sort of, business process re-engineering sort of work. And that really started to take hold in manufacturing organizations. In services, because of the subjective nature of the services, I think because of the subjective nature of the services, and because the fact that so much of the service value is created by people and not by machines and not by the line, it's been harder to put in place. So, I've tried 15 years to put sort of business excellence type frameworks and operational excellence frameworks into banks, and with varying success. Every time you think you've got one step forward, you get one step sort of back. So I think there are different sectors and different industries within sectors. Now, hospitals and healthcare are a great sort of example of a service sector which is starting to make great inroads. I was lucky enough to go and visit a Virginia Mason Hospital in Seattle in Washington. This would be a good sort of 8 or 9 years ago. And their chief medical officer had really sort of grasped the idea of lean.
Right.
And along with sort of things like sort of the checklist manifesto about the use of checklists, he had really started to operationalize the hospital, the way the hospital worked, with a group of people who, have tended to sort of for their whole life, the surgeons have come through very focused on their own skill and craft, but then to try and standardize and industrialize how you do an appendectomy was a serious challenge. But their mortality rates and the recovery rates were so much better than other hospitals because of applying some of these techniques, which was fantastic to see.
Yes, yeah. That's great. Obviously with some processes, it's not life or death, but with a lot of processes, it is. It's people's lives on the line. I remember or recall a story that was shared with me in one of these conversations with someone working for NASA, I think it was, and they had their processes documented, and they were were optimized, but the process performers or participants would, in this particular case, would cut corners, and then it sort of led to the outcome not being what the process had intended. I can't quite remember the fine details about it, but it is in some cases it is highly vital that a process is well defined, well governed, well managed, and improved as well, and that it is followed as well.
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and health and safety is a significant driver of process performance, because if you want to make sure you're getting, you're looking after your staff, if you're managing the health and well-being of your staff, then you need to have standardized processes. And clearly manufacturing and industries and mining, etc., have been sort of great proponents of this. And I think that's, one of the interesting aspects that I think most banks in Australia, their LTIFR, or their injury frequency rate, is worse than in mining. And people are really shocked when they hear that. Now, the injuries are different. It tends to be a lot of repetitive strain type injuries and trip type injuries, but it's the fact that the focus isn't there. And as I say, the focus isn't there because they don't think it's a dangerous workplace. And because you haven't got that focus, then you haven't had this real push to sort of drive better health and safety outcomes by having better processes.
Yes, right. And over the 15 years that you have been working, I guess at a high level in various banks here in Australia, what have, you mentioned before you've seen, sometimes it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yep.
What are some of the biggest challenges, I guess, banks face when adopting BPM?
There are a lot. And I think it's the same with any sort of initiative or a new strategic direction. The first thing is you have to have very, very senior sponsorship. And most banks I've come across, and this is not just in Australia, for them, that sort of the operations process mindset, they don't have process professionals in their senior ranks. I don't know of a single chief operating officer in any bank that is actually a process engineer. Whereas if you go into automotive, it's almost unheard of that the head of manufacturing would be anything other than an automotive engineer, or chemicals would be a chemical engineer, etc. But in banks, for whatever reason, there isn't this sort of cadre or this body of professional process professionals at senior levels. So you've got no one really championing this now. I mean, it's starting to change because of the regulatory focus that lots of banks are sort of having placed upon them. But they don't have that sponsorship. The other aspect, because they don't have the sponsorship, then you don't have the training programs. You're not sort of bringing in lots of process engineers. And it's really sort of interesting to see that in the early 2000s, lots of the automotive manufacturing businesses started to close down in Australia. Their process engineers and automotive engineers came into financial services. And they thought all their Christmases had come at once because they could just see all this waste and all this opportunity. But 12 months later, they were struggling because it's like trying to catch smoke. They couldn't just realize the potential because processes in banks are different to processes in sort of automotive. So you started to get some of them coming through. But I think what happened, because you didn't have that senior sponsorship, you've got and the senior execs were very focused on outcomes, and they were expecting outcomes immediately. When the outcomes don't sort of turn up within 3 months or 6 months, they just get bored. Right. And so there'll be a cost-cutting drive, and all these process engineers will get sort of, made redundant. They'll turn up at another bank who's just sort of going through their wave of process engineering. 2-3 years later, they get made redundant from that, and they go back to the first bank. So you've had these waves where it takes quite a long time to really build up the capability and the acknowledgement of the profession, because the processes are so fragmented. The technology is, there's so much legacy technology still in these organizations. They're not joined up with end-to-end process-aware information systems or workflow systems. They don't have ERP systems in place. Some of the applications are 40 years old, and they're green screen, and they get 2 updates a year. So the underlying, and obviously sort of most of the processes are heavily automated, but then you have all these interventions partway along, which are highly manual, because a project has run out of money, hasn't been able to complete, so a manual workaround is put in place to bridge one application to the next application. And that's where all the defects and all the error rates appear. And that's why it's so hard to make these work. So you've got high volumes of transactions, complex processes, fragmented processes, complex legacy technology, limited sort of understanding and support from the most senior executives. And because it takes so long to get the improvement on any individual process, they just sort of run out of energy, run out of momentum, and they move to the next sort of opportunity. And I don't think there's certainly not a bank in Australia which wouldn't be remediating its mortgage process, and it's been doing it for 15 years. And every year they declare victory when the bonus season comes around, and the following year then they have to fix it again because they still haven't fixed it.
Right, and for someone that's listening to you talk about this right now, and maybe they're working in the financial services area, and they're maybe I guess relating to what you're talking about, and I guess the uphill battle it is. What do you do if you find yourself in that position? Do you just wait out those cycles until there is a senior leader that has a process-centric way of viewing or managing the business, or is there anything you can do or to start working towards?
Absolutely, there is. And it's about focusing on the outcomes, because it's very hard. If you go into an organization and you see things completely different to the way the organization works, you're not going to change a 45,000 person organization overnight, especially if you're somewhere in the middle of that sort of that management layer. So you have to assimilate to the culture of the organization and listen to the language that the execs use. What is it they're looking for? Because the outcomes they're looking for are exactly the outcomes you get from a great sort of BPM sort of oriented organization. They're still looking for great customer outcomes. They want processes to be efficient, effective, reducing their costs. They want to be compliant with their regulations. They want their staff to enjoy their work and not feel frustrated that things don't work. They're all the outcomes you get from a good BPM sort of regime. It's just that because they don't necessarily have that sort of background, they don't know that this is the way to achieve those outcomes. So you have to both find the sweet spot. Where is it that sort of the organizations are concentrating their energy? And it's usually in the mortgage process, or it might be in the payment process or account opening. There aren't that many processes in these banks. So you find one that's already got lots of attention. You find one that's already got lots of money being thrown at it to try and fix. And you focus on the small part that you can actually address to get those outcomes up and running. When I first joined the first bank I joined, I came into like a support role. It was a head of manufacturing on a process improvement type role. And I had a small team of process engineers working with me and operational excellence experts. And we would go in as internal consultants to help align businesses. And it was really, really difficult, because even though we thought we were sort of great at stakeholder management, they weren't our processes. And you'd get sort of, lots of people doing all the right political things, nodding along, saying, yes, we're doing it, but never actually really sort of changing the behaviors or embedding the behaviors the way it wanted to do, or they found it hard to. So then I learned that for me, the easiest way to demonstrate the benefits of this type of approach was I took on a role where I was a line manager. So I ran a payments business, and I could then sort of, directly influence what actually happened in that business, as opposed to indirectly try to influence. And that was a great way, because I could demonstrate I had the same metrics, which I ran for 7 or 8 years, and I could show ongoing continuous improvement, on ongoing continuous performance improvement. I didn't have any money to invest on it. There was a transformation team running alongside that had lots of money, and we worked very well together. But the things that I was doing were much more sort of in the near term. And so it demonstrated, it was very much aligned to the business outcomes we were looking for. We were driving quality significantly. We were engaging the team. We were delivering better customer outcomes, faster payments, etc., to customers. And I was doing that even though I never used the language of BPM. I sort of tried to make it as language neutral as possible. So I didn't, I tried to stay away from Six Sigma type language or lean type language. It was just use the culture of the organization, and you adapt what you know are the underlying principles into that organization, but focus on facts and data. Focus on trying to make it every day better than the day before. And just very, very simple things. And try, and without sort of proselytizing or being sort of a complete disciple, just try to encourage all of your team members to take control of their own environment and fix what they can fix. You can't, there's just too much to fix to do everything. But by sort of, spreading the word and getting other people to drive the improvement, we were able to make, significant changes far better than if I was just trying to do it on my own and trying to take a very hardcore sort of like manufacturing sort of BPM engineering type approach. You just have to go with simple tools and encourage people. And, you know, when you're starting at quite a low level of process maturity, you can't suddenly expect people to be doing sort of quite complex BPM things like, you know, building simulation models. They're just not going to do it. So you have to make it easy for them to understand and encourage that inquisitiveness. So why is there a bottleneck there? I don't know, you tell me, you know, which was culturally very difficult because I had sort of teams spread across different countries around the world. And for some cultures, they expected the senior leader to have all the answers. And in some cases, you know, I didn't know what the answer was, but in many cases I didn't, because I'm not close enough to the work. I'm not actually doing the work on a day-to-day basis. But when they asked me a question and I said, I don't know, what do you think? Most of the time that was me getting them to try to think and to learn the principles firsthand without saying, here's a textbook, go and read the textbook and now try to put it into practice. And that was, you know, it took a long time, but suddenly, you know, they you know, that sense of empowerment when they realized that it was, they were allowed to do things, they were allowed to make change. But there were, I think one of the hardest things as a leader is allowing someone to fail, because that's a key part of their learning. They want to make a change. They've done all what they think is the right analysis. They've come to a conclusion, and you're looking at it and you know that they've missed a critical aspect of that analysis. Now, you could just step in and say, oh, don't do that. That's wrong. You need to do this. Or you can just say, oh, it's looking really, really good. Wait for it to fail. What could you have done differently? Why was that? Let's go back to the drawing board. You know, how did we miss this? Now, clearly, you've got to pick your time and place, and you don't want to expose the individual to any risk or the team to any risk. You don't want to expose the organization or customers to any great risk. But you have to learn by doing, and you have to learn by many cases by making mistakes. And that was the hardest part as a leader of teams, trying to build this type of capability.
Yes, right. And you mentioned there, you know, being, I guess, encouraging the mindset or the idea that fix what you can fix. And I'd imagine that what that approach fosters is being able to, I guess, start small, focused, I guess, generate those wins, prove the value on a smaller level, so that you can then, I guess, you know, if you're fixing a problem, you're going to have more problems thrown at you, because it's like, hey, if you fix that, we've got these other areas that we want to improve now. Do you have examples of or stories of, I guess, where BPM was implemented or adopted, or, you know, a process was incrementally improved or radically transformed, where it did generate a lot of value for the business?
Yes, I mean so I think, you know, there's obviously this great sort of debate that goes on in the textbooks, and particularly with the operational world, about continuous improvement versus transformation, or, you know, transformational change. And I'm a big fan of you need both, but there are different skills and different people. And so the last role I was in, the last bank I was in, I was in charge of the line management team, sort of processing all these payments, for example. And there'd been sort of an organizational change, which meant that the transformation that was about to take place was of the payments business that I was running was going to be run by another leader who is essentially sort of a colleague of mine. And the CEO took us both into his office and looked at both of us sort of straight in the eye. He was quite a ferocious character. And he just said, you two are accountable for the transformation. And I felt sort of, you know, I was feeling a bit annoyed about this, because I actually wanted to do the transformation and not just sort of, you know, keep the lights on. And I thought, well, my colleague here, he's got all the money. He's going to be doing all the sort of the board updates about how the transformation is going. He's going to be doing all the sexy stuff about sort of, you know, playing with blockchain, trying sort of, you know, building the new payments platform. And I'm just going to be dealing with all the old stuff, just trying to keep the place together whilst the transformation appears. And then when I left that sort of meeting, I thought, well, I'm not going to hang around for 3 or 4 years just doing that. It's going to be too boring. We've actually got to fix things. And I was getting some, pretty intense phone calls for things that were going wrong from the chief operating officer. So we started on a quality program. And this was how I sort of really sort of built the interest of the team and got the buy-in of the team. And there's about 1,500 people in the team doing this, scattered across 32 different countries. And they were all at different starting points. So some of the I guess the more mature markets were relatively sophisticated, relatively automated, where others were sort of very, very manual in terms of their approach. But I had to get everybody moving together in some way. So the common denominator was quality. They'd been so used to having programs which were just about cost reduction and offshoring. And so they were very wary of any new sort of change. But everybody wanted to do a better job. Everybody wanted to do the better, sort of get better outcomes for customers and make it easier to do their jobs. They were frustrated when they're having to copy and paste the customer's account number into 5 different systems and forgetting to clear the cache. So they got the wrong account number in there. And then there was a huge investigation to go and fix up why they'd made this a very normal human error. And because we didn't have lots of process engineers to help, and because we didn't have any real money to do this, we had to start from very simple principles. So we had to start with, we did what I call, it's a bit of an improvement ladder, where we wanted to do stop doing things that didn't add any value, or the reports we were creating that no one ever read. Consolidate, so we swept things into piles. So we got all people doing similar sort of work, working together, so that they could learn from each other. Standardize. So you'd have 2 people sitting next to each other working on the same process, doing it differently. So finding, what's the one way, best way to do something, but getting the team to do it, not, me telling them, or not some sort of third-party consultant coming in and telling them how to do it. They figured it out for themselves. Once you'd standardize, then you could simplify, take all that waste out, and then we could get into re-engineering. Now, they're very typical steps in a process improvement journey, and you go on from re-engineering into sort of tactical type automation, lots of robotic stuff, before you get into the sort of the full-blown transformation. And sort of outsourcing and offshoring sometimes fits in there. As an organization, we'd started at the other side. We were doing transformation, robotics, outsourcing, offshoring, but we hadn't done the bits right at the start. And so all these changes were being done to the team. So they were feeling pretty victimized by all of this. And especially when things went wrong, it was the team that sort of got all the complaints and all the noise, but it was because stuff was being done to them. So I had to change that culture so they could take control over their own destiny, but also give them a pathway to make things a bit easier, and just train them on a few basic tools, how to do problem solving, root cause analysis, pokey-yoki, or sort of fail-safing and things like that, failure modes and effects analysis, without using sort of the terminology. A3 is another one for just sort of very simple projects, once again, without using the terminologies. I sort of did a bit of train the trainer. We got all these people focused on this. And what happened was that there'd been a business case put forward for the transformation, which was going to deliver a certain number of cost benefits from the operational efficiency. And there were lots of other benefits that were going to come from it as well. But the primary one associated with the current day-to-day team was operational efficiency, because the stuff that my team were doing was going to be automated.
Right.
4 years into this quality program, the quality program had already delivered all of those financial benefits, and it was featured in the company's annual report and half-yearly reports for, I think, about 3 years running, which there were metrics which showed the defects per million opportunities just progressively reducing. The transformation program was still going, and it ran for another sort of 3 or 4 years, even though the financial benefits had been delivered not by anything the transformational program had done, but just by what the team had done from a quality perspective. They also, they won awards. They got sort of, the highest risk rate, or sort of the best risk rating you can get within sort of the internal auditing approach. And they delivered some of these fantastic outcomes, but it was just by the team. And so, we didn't hire any specialist resources to help us. We just sort of, gave them a few sort of simple tools and set them off on a path which they could execute themselves. And they did a superb job.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. And I would say that, like, as well as obviously getting sponsorship or buy-in from senior leadership, as being obviously, until you get that buy-in, you need to prove the value in BPM and get those small wins. But then also working with the process performers or process participants, those that are actually conducting or part of a process. If as BPM specialists or managers, if we're going in there and making any changes to what's being done, there is an element of, needing to work with these people as well and getting sponsorship or maybe not sponsorship, but like buy-in from these people. Because if you're coming in and saying, hey, I know you were doing the process like this one day, but now it's this. If you have any resistance from these people, that's only going to slow down, I guess, the adoption of these process improvements further. So how do you go about getting that buy-in from process participants?
So that's so important. I think that's what I was alluding to when that first job I had at the first bank I worked at was this as head of manufacturing, and I was that process expert that was going into the process participants and trying to encourage them to do things differently. And I was getting the 1,001 ways of saying no, beginning with the word yes, just all the resistance, because all they thought was I was there to take their job away.
Right.
So they're always, smile and wave, saying the right things, but they never did what was asked of them. So I could see that was going to be a real blocker to deploying some of these techniques. And my way of trying to deal with that was I need to actually to run one of these teams with the process participants so I can have a bit more direct control over how they change, how they work.
Right.
And so that's I guess for most of those 15 years, I've been running teams of process participants. And the change team, so I refer to it as run and change. The change teams, the ones with the people doing the process modeling, etc., I've had to try to manage that relationship when they come in. So we had, as I mentioned earlier, had a transformation going alongside my day-to-day continuous improvement and running program. And the transformation team had, significant resources. Now, I could have, as many leaders have done, just pushed them away and done the smile and wave and saying, yep, we're all good here, we don't need you, but we'll do it just for the good of the organization, but really be quite politically defensive.
Right.
But I saw it as an enormous opportunity, because one of the things we knew was that the type of work my teams were doing wasn't work that we should be doing. It was highly manual, it's lots of clerical, lots of data entry type work. We could be doing far more value-added activities if we could free up this if we could automate these processes. So we needed the transformation team. But I also needed my team to feel comfortable that they weren't going to do themselves out of a job. So I had to build relationships across the team. We had made sure that the change team were doing lots of floor walks, that they were doing they were actively involved in the runtime business. They were sharing their updates. We had working groups which mixed teams from both the run and the change. We had representation. We had common goals, common alignment. There's a whole raft of activities we put in place. I got secondments. I got my team to go and work in the change team, because I'm a big fan of, you need to walk in the other person's shoes, because no one's got an easy job, but you have to see both perspectives. So I get people from the change team to come and work in the ops line. I get people from ops to go and work in the change team. And my colleague who was running that program was extraordinarily generous and very, he helped us out with budgets when I had big budgets cuts. He would just pay for it. I'd just move my people into his team, and he would pay for the team to keep going. And it was a great way of binding the two together. You can't run them independently. And the number of times I'd have the process modelers and the process engineers come up with a process, and they come into the team and say, well, that's not what happens. Right. So you have to have the teams working together to a common outcome. And one of the big things in banks and financial services is just the amount of variation. So it is practically impossible to model all of the processes in a traditional way. So if you go and get the guys into the room, you've got the process engineers from the change team, they've got the brown paper out, the Post-it notes out, they've invited a bunch of SMEs to tell me how you make an outward payment to the UK. From a commercial customer's account. Well, first of all, getting everybody into the room is a nightmare because it's just they're spread across so many different departments, countries. And the way that the banks have restructured over the last 30, 40 years, they've chopped them up into ever smaller silos, and they're constantly evolving. So no one knows the end-to-end process anymore. And the gaps when you sort of hand off from one team to another, no one knows what happens in the middle. So it's extraordinarily difficult to extract out of the SME's brains what actually happens. And what you tend to do is you just tend to get the happy path.
Right.
However, I mean, what my team did was process payments, everything apart from card-based payments. So not your debit cards or your Apple Pay type transactions, but everything else, whether it's cross-border payments, whether it's checks, whether it's the salary payments going from the internet, etc. And we had 8,500 sets of work instructions to process payments. Now, as an outsider, when you think, oh, it's not that hard, is it? You just take money from that account and you send it to that account. You can't, it can't be that difficult. But large corporate institutional clients that we would process payments on their behalf, they all had their own bespoke arrangements. So there was no such thing as a happy path. That's wrong. You might get sort of, 50, 60% of transactions going down a happy path for a particular type, but there's still lots and lots of variation, and you never capture that in a process model.
Right.
So that's why, the teams need to be close, and that's why I'm so keen to understand how process mining can help with that particular aspect, because when you take an event log and you create sort of your process model, most people want to see what the happy path is, or so the most common variants. In a bank, the landmines are the uncommon variants. So you need to be able to see every one. It's the variant that happens, once in every 1,000 transactions that cost you $1 billion because you've breached some regulatory requirement.
Right.
So you never pick those up when you're just asking SMEs, because they can't remember, or maybe they skip a step and they don't want to actually tell you what they do because they know they're skipping a step. So you've got all these sort of quirky human dynamics, which gets in the way of the facts and data that really explicitly state what happens when, so you can then understand the risk and design it out.
And just, I guess, on the topic of process mining, because obviously over the last 5, 10, 15 years, there's been an increase in technology when it comes to the way organizations manage their business processes. What do you see? What does the future of BPM look like over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years? And where do you feel like organizations should really be investing time, effort, and energy?
There's a couple of things. Just leading on from that previous conversation, the first thing for me, that the real benefit of something like process mining is being able to accurately reflect what is actually happening in a far faster way than you can do by just getting a bunch of SMEs together. So that idea that this is what's actually happening, assuming you have the data. I think that organizations are moving at such a pace, and there's so much inherent complexity now, that their requirement for BPM, for good process management, is ever greater than it was before. You can't just get away by ignoring it. So it's becoming more critical because you have to simplify. And I love that manufacturing analogy of the sort of the postponement strategy, where I use an example of pretty much every car that rolls off a production line these days in a modern automotive plant is different. You don't get two cars the same. But if you ask for a pink colored Volkswagen Golf with a 2.324 litre petrol engine, left-hand drive, red velour seats, you can't have one. Not unless you're prepared to spend millions and millions of dollars on it, with a chassis that's maybe sort of 2 centimeters longer than the standard chassis. So what they've done is they've modularized it and parameterized it. And that's made it much easier to give a customer a set of choices, but without killing the manufacturing process. That for me is the sort of where services need to go to. What is that sort of that menu of choices with the number of parameters that gives the customer the sense that they've got a personalized experience, but doesn't kill the process environment. I think Chipotle, it's got, you can have, endless number of variants of how you like your Mexican food to be served to you, but there's only 160 or 70 ingredients that are kept in the kitchen.
Right.
And it's just the same food. It's just all wrapped differently, basically. And that's what you need to get to a service environment. But to do that, you need to have really, really strong understanding of process and how process works. You need to understand process analytics, process metrics, process data. Terms like throughput cycle time, defect rates, rework, etc., just need to be an intrinsic part of the way that people think about the work that they do, whether that not just the process engineers or the process experts. It needs to be everyday people. To be able to do that off a fact base, you're going to need people who understand data. They've got to understand how the data architecture works and make amends for the data faux pas of the past and make that data accessible, expose the data, and people to be able to the business experts who understand how the products work to be able to access that data and stitch it together. So I think there is a far greater need than ever before within service environments, particularly because I think sort of manufacturing is way ahead on this than services, to build a broader knowledge of process expertise. It's not just in the process engineers. You need everybody to having a much broader understanding of process, but they need simplified tools. And I was talking to a colleague the other day who's working at one of the banks. They've now got lots of the ingredients that should drive this in a more sustainable way. So they've got senior stakeholders who want to see process management in place. They've got the right tool sets, they've invested in their tool sets. They've got the regulators saying they want to see it. But there's a gap in terms of people just see, oh, it's process mapping. It's really easy. We can teach people in a half an hour. And this colleague of mine, he's had 15, 20 years of deep BPMN expertise, and is saying they're just designing rubbish.
Right.
Because they don't understand the modeling languages and what the inference of modeling in a certain way does. And this is not just about drawing some pretty boxes on a page. There is a genuine flow pattern and a control flow that you're building here. So you need to build up the knowledge. You need the right tools. You've got to make that easier for people to assimilate. Not everybody wants to be a process engineer. So we've got to make it simpler for them, more accessible for them. And then we've got to use the data far more effectively, which probably means tidying up and cleaning up data in lots of the organizations, because then you can achieve that sort of goal lots of senior execs are looking for. They want simpler business models.
Right.
But to do that, this is a plate of spaghetti and you're trying to unpick it strand by strand. So I think I'd feel, and in fact, I guess the proof of the pudding for me was one of the four large banks in Australia, a bank called Westpac, had some serious issues with the regulators. It sort of landed a $1.3 billion penalty. Basically, poorly designed processes, staff not trained, and poor technology. And they've recognized that they are going to have to sort of invest in this. But at their half-year results in May, what they announced was that they're making their bank far simpler, and it would have like a reduced headcount. And so lots of the media questions were about, how many people are going to get sacked? It's, well, this is not just about sacking people. We actually need to sort of hire people. We need to get data experts in place. And for the first time, I heard a CEO say, and we need process engineers. I have never heard a CEO or one of their DRs say we need process engineers in a bank. So for me, that is such a positive sign. And I know from contacts in banks around in Europe and North America, that, and lots of the Asian banks, they're in a similar sort of position. They're starting to recognize the criticality of people who understand process, can work with the data guys, and can work with the business people. And the three together with a good sort of smattering of analytics is what you're going to need to make this successful.
That's great. That's really good. Thanks for sharing that. There was a lot in there, but I'm sure that our audience is going to glean a lot from what you're sharing with us. But I guess for those that are listening to this or will be listening to this, I think it's hard not to have your interest piqued when you hear about how BPM can be adopted and the value it can bring to an organization. But for someone that's maybe learning about BPM for the first time, or maybe not the first time, but they've seen how it can be effectively seen that it does deliver value, because there are a lot of examples where, and I think it does come down to language, but if you talked about BPM, an organization might be like, oh yeah, process mapping, we tried that, we did that, we tried it for 2-3 years, got to the end of that sort of period, and we ended up just with a stack of processes that just sat there collecting dust, and like, what was the point of it? What's the purpose of it? I guess for those that you've piqued their interest, where do they go now to learn more about what BPM can do? And yeah, whether it's resources or particular key influential people that they can go and learn from, because obviously every organization is different and will be facing different challenges and are at a different process maturity level. But yeah, where do you go to learn more about this topic?
Well, there's PEX, which is like sort of the one of the forums that sort of is really sort of focused on process expertise. There's the Lean Enterprise, and so just great web resources. You do any web search for lean experts or process experts, and you'll get a long list. The software providers, they also have a huge amount of resource, and what they're quite clever at doing. So this is like, organizations like Celonis and Signavio. They've got all these industry white papers, which shows how that their technology can be incorporated in practice into organizations. So they are the good places to go. Find people who've done it, who you can just talk to, because every time I speak to someone who works in this area, I learn something every time, and I've been doing it for a long time now. But there's never a conversation I have, and whether that's with a process engineer or whether it's a process operator, you learn something new, and having your eyes and ears open to new learnings. Because the key thing for me is, don't be a BPM zealot. Don't think that this is the only way that things can get done. You have to be flexible, you have to be adaptable, and you have to be able to fit into your environment. So, for example, a lot of organizations have gone through new ways of working, and they've adopted Agile. And I found myself right at the start of this just being really cynical. This was just another bank set of restructures. We don't really understand Agile, but we've seen it works really well at an organization on the other side of the earth. So let's just go and do it without understanding any of the consequences. We're not Spotify, we're a bank. Regulators sort of get a bit upset if we put all of our document our changes on Post-it notes and then throw them in the bin. So so just don't get so fixated on your on labeling yourself as the BPM guy, or as the Six Sigma guy, or as the Agile guy. Adapt and change as the organization is changing, but hold on to the underlying principles of which to be true. And just constantly in your day-to-day work, just try and progressively just introduce new thinking, new learning, to encourage people to learn, to ask questions. There's an example, lots of people get sort of hung up in when they're talking through about sort of BPM, about process ownership. And it's a big deal in financial services, because there's a thing called the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, which was putting execs on the hook for processes, essentially.
Right.
And so there's lots of debates about process ownership, and people think you have to have a single process owner. And in the beautiful terminology of you can hear around the place, it's one throat to choke. When things go wrong, who you're going to sort of hang out to dry. Now, in most financial service organizations, lots of service industries, these processes cut across many different departments, and it's almost impossible to think one person can control it. And one of the scenarios that was used at the sort of bank I was at was, well, let's assume there is a significant payment systems outage that our customers lose lots of money, the bank loses lots of money. Who's to blame? Well, it's a systems outage. Has to be the CIO. And then the CIO stands up to defend themselves and said, yeah, but hold on a second. We've been pointing out this bit of kit is outdated. You can't get updates anymore. And we've been telling you need to pay for the change for the last sort of 5 years. So the product owner then gets defensive. Yeah, well, I know. And I've had it on the investment slate for the last 5 years, but it's never been prioritized. And so, well, who's accountable? And there's a great story I had from a colleague of mine who he's old enough now he worked with Deming sort of back in the 80s, and he set up the business excellence framework in Australia. And he was in the middle of one of these debates going on about, process ownership and the one throat to choke. And he was just like sitting on the side, just listening. And he said to the person that was getting pretty fired up in the conversation, the most senior person in the room, you've got kids, haven't you? And this person said, yeah, I have. And he said, who's accountable for bringing up your kids, you or your partner? And it was that sense of suddenly, well, you don't have to have single process owner. You can have multiple process. You have to have very clear rules about what it means to be a joint process owner and what you can and can't do, and the handoffs and the relationship between you two. But you don't have to have it. And it's far easier if there's only a single process owner. We know that. But doesn't it preclude you from having alternate models? It's just how you make it work. And that's what I'm saying. So don't get locked into there is only one way of doing things. Use the principles, adapt the principles to suit the organization you're in. And I think that's sort of, one of the key lessons I've learned is one size doesn't fit all when you try to go in there. And, every time I've gone to a new team or a new organization, I've gone in with my 100-day plan and I've thrown it out after 5 days and had to create a new one because it just didn't fit.
Right. No, that's great. Well, it's, there is a lot to this topic. And I think that, we have a wide audience that listens to this series, and whether it's from senior leadership all the way down to, subject matter experts or BPM specialists or BPM managers. And I think, we can only fit so much in, we've been talking for about 45, 50 minutes now on this topic. And there are just that many things to cover. There's very few, topics we can really dive into. But I know I've certainly been gleaning a lot from you in this conversation today. Been taking a lot of notes, and I hope that for the people that are listening, you've been taking a lot of notes as well. And if you do have any, follow-up questions for Nigel, feel free to pop those questions into the comment section below, whether you're watching this on YouTube or LinkedIn or on one of the podcast apps. And I'm sure Nigel won't mind you reaching out and connecting with him on LinkedIn to be able to answer any of those questions you have. But I guess on behalf of the Process Pioneers team in our community, I'd like to thank you, Nigel, for sitting down with me today and sharing the many years of experience and stories that you've been able to.
Been great, Daniel. Thank you for asking me.